You know the Jane Austen novel, Pride and Prejudice. I know you do. Yes, Pride and Prejudice, our literary people. Yes, wonderful. Okay, and you know the many adaptations. You know the many movie adaptations. Some of you particularly know the 2005 adaptation. Yes, the best one. I know. This is what, you're like, no, not that Pride and Prejudice. The Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice. The Keira Knightley Elizabeth Bennet, Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is about, a number of anxious sisters living in a house in the country in England. And they're like, how are we going to navigate all the social stuff and find husbands and deal with the unfairness of being women in this time and all these sorts of things. And, there's this interesting scene. Lizzie, Elizabeth Bennet, is sort of like the fiery, romantic, marches to the beat of her own drum. Some of her sisters are more trying to fit into the social mores a little more quickly. Lizzie's like, I'm going to marry for romance or I'm not going to marry, at all. And there's this moment early in the book where there's this guy, Mr. Collins, who shows up asking for her hand in marriage. And Mr. Collins is, he's a minister, and he is he's a self-obsessed, insecure minister. So there you go. And, he can't stop talking about his patroness, and he asks for Lizzie's hand in marriage, and he's just an insufferable person, and she says no. And of course, no one can kind of understand, how could you say no? You're getting a little bit older, Lizzie, all this sort of stuff. You're rolling the dice. She says no, but she's like, nobody could accept this guy in marriage. He's a total, he's that. That's what he is. And so she says no. So a couple scenes later, one of her friends shows up, Charlotte, and Charlotte has some interesting news. Mr. Collins has turned right, after professing his love to Lizzie, Mr. Collins is the sort of person who would turn right around and propose to somebody else, one of her friends. And Charlotte has said yes. And there's this really interesting scene because Lizzie just cannot understand how Charlotte would have said yes to this guy. Just cannot understand it. And they start to talk about it, and just even the look at Lizzie's face just immediately changes the tone of the conversation. And Charlotte kind of goes into a mode of self-defense, and Lizzie tries to jump in, but Charlotte is like, no, you need to listen to what I have to say. This is what Charlotte says in response to the judgment that Lizzie gives her in this moment. She says, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Lizzie, don't look at me like that. Not all of us can afford to be romantic. I've been offered a comfortable home and protection. I've no money, no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents. And here's the real honest moment. I'm frightened. So don't judge me, Lizzie. Don't you dare judge me." Right? Lizzie's not able to imagine somebody else's experience and imagine what they could be going through such that she might have reason to say yes where Lizzie had said no. And Charlotte's line here is just the cry of every single person who's done something where they feel misunderstood, right? Don't judge me. Don't you dare judge me. We live in a world of judgment, and we live in a world of harsh judgment of one another because we don't understand one another, and many times we don't really seem to desire to understand one another. We're not seeking to understand what each other are going through, and so we judge other people, and we harm them, and really, actually, we're going to see over the course of the sermon, we're harming ourselves as we do this in a particular way, because, of course, it's not just that we judge people that really causes the problem. It's the fact that we judge people according to a standard with which we don't judge ourselves. Right, this is what really begins to come out as we experience a judgmental world and our judgments of other people and the way that other people judge us. We realize that when people judge other people, they pull from a different standard than the one that they wish that they were judged by, or the standard that we use to judge ourselves internally. And there's a word that we have to describe this unfair judgment of other people, and it's called hypocrisy. It's called being a hypocrite, where I judge other people according to a different standard than one that I use to judge myself. And we live in a world of hypocrites, and all judgment that we receive in the world is hypocritical, and there's some particular cost to this that we pay in the world because the world is just full of hypocrites, but also in ourselves as we become people who are deeply run by hypocritical currents and self-deceived currents in our lives. But the Bible says that there is one source of judgment from one place in reality that is not hypocritical, and it's the sort of judgment that comes from God. The Bible says that God is not a hypocrite, that what God says, God does. There's no disconnect whatsoever in God's life between what he says and what he does. And so God is not hypocritical, and God is the one place that we can go in the world to receive a perspective that is totally free from hypocrisy. We started a sermon series last week on Romans. We're going to be in Romans all year. We're going to be from Romans 2:12 through chapter 8 all year. Don't worry, we're going to do some Easter stuff. We're going to do some Advent stuff. So you're going to get to come up from air once or come up for air once or twice. But mostly we are in Romans all year. And last week we started by looking at Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. It's kind of an important sermon, and if you're going to be with us for the Romans sermon series, I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to last week's sermon or watch last week's sermon on YouTube, because it's sort of two sermons in one. It's the sermon series intro sermon, well, three sermons in one. It's the sermon series intro sermon, plus the Romans introduction, plus an actual sermon on Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. So now you know what kind of a preacher I am. We're just going to fit it all in at once. And if you did not get the Romans introduction material in particular, there are just things you're not going to know about the book. You're not going to know who Paul is. You're not going to know why he's writing. You're not going to know when he's writing. You're not going to know the content, any of that stuff. So I would really encourage you to go back and listen to that so you can just get caught right up to speed and you can just jump in with us and know what's going on in the book of Romans. Last week, we were just softly introducing the idea that in these first couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at some initial things that Paul has to say about the rules. That's really why we're going to be in Romans, to learn about the rules and the law and what they're for and how we relate to them and how we can relate to the rules in a way that's for our benefit, and how sometimes we relate to the rules in a way that is harmful to us and to other people. And we talked about how last week there are just a few couple introductory things about the rules that we're going to see in the next 4 or 5 weeks. The first 3 that we're going to look at are bummers about the rules, and then the last 2 that we're going to look at are things that are positive about the rules. Last week, anyone remember the bummer about the rules that we looked at last week? The rules are unable to do something in particular. They're unable to make the world... Exactly. The rules are not able to make the world fair. They're supposed to make the world fair, but actually in practice, they're not able to do that. That's what we looked at last week. This week, we're looking at how the rules create hypocrites. The world is not able to make the world fair, and this week we're going to be looking at how the rules create hypocrites. I've titled today's sermon, God's Not a Hypocrite. We are in Romans chapter 2, verse 17 to 24. If you have a Bible or a device, I'd encourage you to open one up. If you do not own a Bible, we have free Bibles over there. You can take one home and get the Word of God into your house. Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 24, again, is our text today. I'll read the text aloud. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God, and know His will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiments of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. We live in a world full of hypocrites. The word hypocrite comes from the Greek word hypocrite. It comes from the Greek word hypocrisy, which is the word hypocrite. It means to be a pretender, and actually in the ancient world, the word hypocrite had sometimes a theatrical background of playing at something, of pretending something. Now, there's a much more robust theory of acting that doesn't need to derive itself from the idea of being a hypocrite. But linguistically, it does take its background from the Greek theater and the idea that someone's put on a mask, right? All Greek theater was not about this naturalistic style of acting that we have today, where you try to embody the character. You put on a mask. You put something on and you become somebody totally different than the person that you are. And in that putting on of the mask, this word draws the idea that you are a pretender. You're something that you're not. You're putting on a front. A hypocrite is someone whose external and internal life don't match. Someone who says one thing and does another. Someone who says one thing and does another and judges other people as well. And Paul in this passage is calling out hypocrites. Right? Let's look again at Romans chapter 2, verses 21 to 22. He says, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? There are two aspects of hypocrisy on display in this passage, because there are generally two aspects of hypocrisy. One is that people are just doing hypocritical things. They say, like in their own internal life, they say they believe one thing and then they do another. right? That's just on its own an aspect of being a hypocrite, an internal disconnection, a lack of internal overlap and integrity such that I say one thing over here and I do something over here. It's doing the stuff of hypocrisy. But generally, hypocrites add a second layer to this. We're not just saying one thing or doing another. We're saying one thing and doing another and then judging other people. Right? That's a second thing that happens for a hypocrite, and in the acting out of hypocrisy, I say one thing, I do another, and then I judge other people. Now, in the context of Romans chapter 2, we saw last week in Romans 2, 12 to 16, that Paul has just argued that God is fair. Jews and Gentiles will both be judged fairly before the living God. And yet, even as Paul has already argued that in 2:12 through 16, some of Paul's audience could sort of be thinking, if Jews and Gentiles are both going to be judged fairly before God, how wonderful it is to be a Jew because we've gotten the rule book of Moses. We are in possession of the law. So if we're both going to be judged, if both groups of people, Jews and non-Jews, are going to be judged all the same before a fair and holy God, it really is beneficial that there are some of us who got their hands on the law. That really is a beneficial thing. And Paul is anticipating this argument, which is why he jumps in here into 17, right? That's why he says, but if you call yourself, right? That language there in 17, he says, but if. Right? But if, why would he say but if unless he's jumping in and anticipating something? I'm going to come back to this in a later sermon, but you really can't understand Romans if you're not thinking about the thoughts in between the verses that Paul's anticipating. I'm going to point these out as we go, but in order to really understand Romans and the flow of Romans and not get lost in it, you've got to realize that in between certain verses, there is an implicit question that's being asked that Paul's responding to. Why is he responding to that implicit question? Because as I shared last week, the major question that Romans is asking is how could it be that Jews and Gentiles have been made into one new people of God through Christ Jesus? And Paul's been thinking and pastoring in and through this question for about 20 years across the ancient world at this point, so he's had this conversation a million times with different people, so he knows all the arguments and puts and takes. And so he's putting that in here. So he's over and over again imagining, as he's talking, that there's someone over here saying these objections, and he's going, I'm anticipating. So in between 16 and 17, you can imagine someone saying, well, now that we know that God is fair, it really is advantageous, isn't it, to have had access to the law? Because if God's going to judge everybody fairly, who wouldn't want access to the rule book? Amazing and wonderful for me. I have access to the rule book. Incredible. Off we go. And that's why Paul goes, but if you happen to be thinking that, if you call yourself someone who's got the law and the rule book, and then he goes on into his condemnation of hypocrites. That's what he's calling out in the context of Romans chapter 2. Chapter true? I don't know. Every Bible is Romans chapter true. He's calling out something that we see all over the world. Because we live in a world that is just overrun with hypocrisy. We live in a world that is full of hypocrites. The utter stench of hypocrisy is just everywhere we go. Everywhere we go, we get just example upon example upon example. I know you could think of examples. Let's run through some obvious ones. Maybe fitness gurus who preach diet and exercise who really have built their bodies on medication and surgeries, right? They're doing things to give themselves a certain external look that doesn't actually match who they actually are. That's hypocrisy. That's what it is. We see it out in the world. The world sort of calls that good marketing, but the Bible calls that hypocrisy, right? Like lying, living a lie. Athletes and coaches who posture at honesty and fair play, but are willing to do and defend just enough cheating to win. The integrity of the game. The rules. How could you blah, blah, blah. And just a tiny bit of falsehood just to secure our ability to win that thing or move up in the draft order or whatever it is. People who cry law and order when somebody else breaks the law, but they sure want a merciful treatment when they're in trouble. That's a big hypocrisy. People who want to be treated well but can't find it in themselves to be gracious and kind towards other people. Hypocrisy over and over and over. There are obviously many more multiplied examples. And it's important just to recognize that this hypocrisy that we see in the world is not in like the minutia of life. It's not like, there's just so many little minute things to get right that all of us are bound at some point to screw up in one small area and then be hypocritical about it. That's not the point that Paul's making. Paul here is making the point that we are hypocritical in the big, broad brushstrokes of life. That it's the big, important things that we are all hypocrites in. I don't know if you noticed in verse 22, if you were to look at that again in Romans chapter 2, Paul says, while you preach stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? there's a law in the Old Testament with 600 some commands in it. There's also like a prologue to that law given in the book of Exodus where there's like 10 big ones just named right up at the front. And I don't know if you noticed where Paul has grabbed these probing questions from. He's not like, let's look at rule 412. How are you doing in that? And then do you judge other people? He's like, let's look at rules 1, 2, and 3, right? He's like, let's take the broad brushstrokes, the things that we're all supposed to know, right? Don't steal, 10 commandments. No adultery, 10 commandments. No idols, 10 commandments. He's playing the hits, and it's like, we can't even get the little, like the things, the most obvious ones. We're just exposed in our engagement of those as hypocrites. We are hypocritical even in the most basic things. It's unfortunately both religious and secular people who can become hypocrites because it's really anywhere that we see some rules-based morality where we're going to see that there's an opportunity for hypocrisy to come in. For those of us who are religious or have religious backgrounds, it is really important to recognize that religion or religious posture does offer a unique opportunity to become hypocritical because there's just so much rule following in religion. And actually, the word hypocrites, sorry, I wanted to go back and make that joke again. The word hypocrites shows up 17 times in the New Testament, and in almost every case, it shows up in the way that someone who has made themselves a hypocrites in relationship to some religious observance. It's always in some religious thing that someone has made themselves a hypocrite in the uses of hypocrites in the New Testament. Of course, Jesus has a number of places where he really lambastes the religious leaders of his day, and one of the things he calls them over and over again is hypocrites. He says, blind guides, people who give people heavy loads and doesn't even help them carry them. By the way, hypocrites, over and over again. So, for example, in Matthew 23:25, Jesus says this to the religious leaders of his day. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Just look exactly what Jesus is saying here. He's saying hypocrites, people who are false, there's a lack of internal coherence between what they say and what they do. What is the context in which they're made into hypocrites? This place of religious observance. Why are they cleaning the cup and the plates? For the same reason that you clean your cup and plates, but for an added reason. There's a religious purification going on in the washing of things. So this is a religious observance, and these religious leaders are going, in order to be right with God, we've got to be righteous, our items have to be clean, and so we wash them. But Jesus goes, that place of washing is become basically a stumbling block for you, where the fact that you don't care about washing out your insides, washing out your heart, washing out your spirit, such that you're not a person of, greed and self-indulgence and judgmentalism, but you're a person of grace and mercy and love. That there's a lack of coherence there, and this place of religious observance has now become the opportunity for this lack of coherence to grow. Of course, there's also multiplied examples of secular hypocrisy. That may be surprising for some of us to engage with, but the reality is that any worldview that has a strong sense of rules or right and wrong practices gives opportunities for us to become hypocrites. One example that we saw in the news in multiple countries was during COVID. We had multiple governments across multiple Western countries laying down COVID restrictions, and in essentially every area, there were examples of some big politician or lawmaker who said, oh, those rules don't apply to me, right? Why does that happen? Because the rule creates an opportunity for someone to say, well, I don't know, that rule isn't really fair, or I'm the one who can sort of walk the line here. There are opportunities, whatever the worldview, for people to become hypocritical. The problem, there's really a significant cost to hypocrisy. We'll look at some other costs later. But one of the major costs that I think we need to be clear about hypocrisy and how it impacts us and other people when they experience hypocrites is that hypocrisy, the experience of hypocrisy, erodes people's convictions. When people have believed something, when they've looked at something and valued it and given their life to it and really done the leaning of faith onto a thing, onto a belief system, onto a person, when those things have happened and then that person reveals or that thing reveals itself to be saying one thing and doing another, it doesn't just break that person's belief in that thing. It erodes their whole strength of conviction in the first place. It makes it very difficult for someone to get back up again and be like, I'm going to believe anything. I'm going to value anything. I'm going to shoot for a high goal. I'm going to build a strong tower. I'm going to do something large and valuable and meaningful because my conviction, just my strength of conviction in general, has been shaken by feeling like I'm encountering people who are liars or fakers. There are other costs that we'll see with respect to hypocrisy, but that one is one major one. It says, as hypocrisy breaks down people's trust, it leads to disillusionment and it erodes their strength of conviction. Now, I want to think a little bit deeper about this. We often think about hypocrisy as sort of a character trait that's going wrong in someone. Oh, that person's a hypocrite. Maybe it's related to their judgmentalism. And what we need to do in order to fix this is to sort of grow in those character traits. And of course, there's something that's true about that, but I think Paul gives us an example in this passage to look at a deeper level about the way in which being a hypocrite isn't just about something that's going wrong in my character. It's about something deeper about how I'm relating to rules. There's something about how I relate to rules and standards that gives me the opportunity to develop this character flaw. And the issue here is that if we just treat it as like a character flaw, I need to be less judgmental or something like that, we're going to run through the same situation in terms of how we relate to the rules over and over again, and this is actually never going to change, right? So we want to look a little bit deeper, not just into the reality of hypocrisy, but how the rules create the opportunity for hypocrisy, and Paul gives us an opportunity to do this in Romans chapter 2, 17 to 20. The text says this, "But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent, because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor to the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth." We're going to rearrange the order a little bit of what Paul says here, but there's a progression here as someone moves through their relationship to the law from getting the law in the first place to feeling like I should be teaching other people about it. There's a progression in this passage. Let's just get clear about it. The first key word here is the word because. You can leave this up on the screen. Because you are instructed from the law. So that word because tells us that there's some previous grounding that's undergirding what Paul is saying. So it's really the first thing. So because you are instructed from the law, maybe related also to that having in the law, the embodiments of the knowledge of the truth. So what is the first thing that happens here? I'm instructed in the law. I gain access to the rules. I come into the knowledge of the rules and I take them on. There's step one. Next, I rely on them, right? There's like a leaning on them. There's a sense of I don't just have them. I haven't just been instructed by them, but I'm taking them on for me. Again, not things in themselves that are inherently bad, but just looking at the order and the progression of how this moves on. So first, I get them, I'm instructed by them, then I rely on them. Then we have steps 3 or 4, which is probably a little bit interchangeable. The language of knowing God's will and approving of what is excellent. I get the rules, I rely on them, and then as a result of that, I feel like I know what I should do. I know God's will, or I just know the will of the good in general. I know what's good, and I feel like I should do it. Not only that, but I'm able to approve of what is excellent. I feel like I've taken on the rules enough that I don't need to look at the rules all the time to know what's good or bad. I can just do it. I've grown in like a discernment of being able to approve of what is a higher or a lower thing. So let's just walk through steps 1 through 4 again. I've gained access to the rules. I've relied on them. Those rules have given me a sense of I know what God wants for me, or I know what the rules want for me generally. I can distinguish between higher and lower things, and then all of that leads, it doesn't have to, but it leads to an all-important 5th step where I go, because I've done steps 1 through 4, I'm going to jump to step 5. Teach those lost, bad, rule-breaking people. And this is the step that Paul points out and sort of just holds up in front of us and kind of rubs in our noses a little bit, right? It's difficult at times to be reading the Bible for tone, but I think we can pretty safely here read a bit of a mocking and teasing tone in what Paul is saying. If you're sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish. Oh gosh, those foolish, small people who need your instruction, those little children who just need a wise teacher to come over. Notice how Paul gives 4 examples of how the puffed up person might be thinking about themselves, right? Paul's really saying, I know where this has led for you. It leads to a sense of me feeling this way about me. And once we get to this first step that Paul is really poking at, right? we begin to teach other people and instruct other people. And again, it's not so much that there are not cases where we wouldn't teach or instruct other people. It's more the posture that's coming inside of us towards other people that Paul's pulling out by the way that he's kind of mocking this sense of I'm the one who's got authority because of how I've related to the rules to teach other people. And this is what happens. Once we're all the way in this fifth step, we often are really blind to the ways in which we could get things wrong. We're blind to the ways that God might be calling us to relate to other people because we just think, I've got the rules, I've interpreted them rightly, they've done wonderful things for me, and now all those lost little people out there need me to come along and teach them. And this is how our relationship with the rules comes along and makes us someone who would do something hypocritical. In what area of your life do you find this progression? Because Paul here is talking about, the God's law writ large and teaching people about God, but the reality is that this progression can show up in any area of our lives. In any area of our lives, there can be some set of rules that we go, I got that law, I took it on, I got the rules right, I know how to navigate them now, and now everyone else needs me to go and teach them about it. That can show up in any area of our life where there is some law of how to get things right. Let's think of two big areas where this can happen. In general, right, people have something in their mind often about how to live right. What is to live right in relationship to family and relationship to career choices, something like that. And we often our vision of how it is to live right is often related to the things I've gotten right in my life, right? It's I got that right and, miracle of miracles, I also think I should have, right? It's they work together, right? And in whatever area that can crop up, that can be something where we look at other people and if they're experiencing challenge, they're experiencing loss, they're experiencing chronic frustration or things that haven't gone right in their life, we can just have these little thoughts that crop up in our mind that's just honestly because you're not living right. I lived right over here. I did this stuff. I learned about this. I did these things right in the right order. And if you just would too, off you'd go and you wouldn't be complaining anymore. Right? We can do that in any number of areas in our life when we have a sense of how should we live right. Let's think about a more concrete example. Let's think about rules around the house, rules around the apartment. You live with people, if you live alone, this is an area where you are just, smooth sailing. There's nothing I can say to get you in this area. You're totally scot-free. But for everybody else, you have roommates, you have family, you have kids. You're there and you've got a vision of what things should look like in your apartment. And so you find yourself going around saying, pick that thing up. Please put that back there. Please wash that thing, right? We walk around and do that all the time. And of course, the reality is if we were really self-reflective, there are things that we forget to do all the time, where we break our own rules. But of course, here's the problem. If we just judged ourselves by the same standard that we judge the other people we were living with, well, we would be getting things wrong, but we wouldn't be a hypocrite, right? The fact that we let ourselves off the hook says, I'm a hypocrite. This, unfortunately, is me. I'm here to tell you today about myself. My name's Adam, and I'm a hypocrite with respect to what's happening around my apartment. There's areas of other stress in my life, and so when it comes to my apartment, I need a clean, orderly apartment, and so I'm put that thing away there, and that thing has a home. It goes here. It doesn't go there, whatever. And yet I am completely unable to remember to honor my wife's request to put my bag away and to not leave my gloves on the kitchen table. My gloves, I walk around with them. I hold the Subway bars with them. That doesn't gross me out. It grosses my wife out. Maybe it grosses the rest of you sane people out. So she said, when you come home, please don't take your gloves off and put them on the kitchen table. I'm completely unable to remember it over and over again. And yet I just have a seemingly infinite possibility to look with ever-increasing amounts of detail at the little things that she misses. It happens, right? And this is just how this process goes. I see the good news of having an orderly apartment. I've taken on the rules. I've imbibed them for myself. I can discern about what's good and what's bad. I know God's will for our apartment, and so I need to teach everybody else. And I just have an infinite capacity to be blind. I will say honestly forgetful, but also just blind to the ways in which I'm doing things that transgress someone else's vision of what a clean and orderly apartment would look like. You and I do this all the time. We are doing this sort of stuff over and over and over again. And, the problem is that it's just so costly. Even the small things, this is the issue. This is what we need to be taking on, taking away. These little things, they look like small things, but in terms of ourselves, our souls, our internal character, they are caverns. They are just huge ruptures in our spirits. They're huge ruptures in our character. Anything other than one humble, integrated self is just a total rip and tear into multiple different disconnected people inside of us. And all these little hypocrisies are opportunities for us to do that tearing, often in the pursuit of something that, frankly, is so small and unimportant out in the world, and yet internally it just begins to take on huge consequences. There are two consequences in particular that Paul names that are really costly of hypocrisy. The first, well, let's look at the text, Romans 2:23 to 24. The text says this, "You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." Two costs that are identified here. The first is that God is dishonored. I mean, honestly, it's hard to even imagine in some ways how that could be true. God being a being whose own holiness and righteousness is so self-consuming. It's difficult to even imagine how someone could transfer a category like dishonor onto God. But there's something about our rule breaking that dishonors God when we're boasting in the rules, right? We bring dishonor onto anything in which we act out this dynamic, right? So, just for example, like the fitness instructor who's doing the sort of hypocrisy that I described, boasting in the rules, but then cheating to achieve their desired body, they bring dishonor onto the whole fitness enterprise, right? Because that's just what hypocrisy does. It brings dishonor onto the things against which has been hypocritical. That happens with God. We bring dishonor to God when we say, in some way I'm boasting in my self-righteousness, and then I break the rules. To be clear, it's not really the breaking of the rules that dishonors God. It's the boasting in them and then breaking them that dishonors God. If we were to just go, God, I break the rules all the time, I'd love to be better at them, but I break them all the time, and I'm sorry about that. That would not dishonor God. That would just be an honest and humble person living in the reality of what it is to be sinful and fallen and apart from God and being renewed in the image of God's most wonderful Son. There's nothing dishonorable about that. There is something that brings dishonor to God when we boast in, I'm getting this thing right. When we boast in, I'm better than that person at this thing, and then we break the rules. It's not just, however, that God is dishonored. It's also that, we harm other people's perception of God. I mean, there's arguably like nothing more damaging that like we could do to harm like a Christian witness, to harm people's ability to seek out the God who loves them, to be hypocrites. I mean, we could do all sorts of wrong things, all sorts of sins, and if we would respond to those things in an honest and non-hypocritical way, we would just witness to people who love God's truth and who love God's grace, right? But like hypocrisy causes like people's perception of God to be actively harmed. Paul is here quoting a text from Isaiah when he says, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Right? He's saying that hypocrisy causes people to view God in a low and base way. It causes them to speak badly about God in a way that they maybe wouldn't speak badly about God through any other thing we could do. Right? Any other thing we could do might lead them to go, those people are bad. Those people who did that bad thing, like their condemnation would be for the people. But like when we're hypocrites, what we do is we actually like show something about our nature that gets reflected back onto the nature of God. And so then people go, this whole religion God thing creates hypocrites. This whole religion God nonsense is a bunch of lying, false rackets. And hypocrisy causes people to speak that way about God in a way that really nothing else does. And so the costs are really quite high. We have to, as people living in a time where there is a often low view of God, certainly a low view of religion and church, we have to look at our own witness and say how much of people's perception of that is due to the fact that we act like hypocrites. How much of that is due to the fact that the church acts like hypocrites, that it says one thing and does another, that it shows over and over again that it doesn't love truth and honesty and transparency? We have to take a sober look at that and say how much of our witness can be improved by just saying, I just don't want to be a hypocrite anymore. And our churches can be any number of things. The one thing we can't be is hypocritical. It's like the only thing we can't be. That should be the vision of our church. We have no idea anything else that's happening. We won't be a hypocrite, though. Come to this church. I mean, there's something that might work about that. People might go, wow, that's new, right? That's different. That we would just lead with our commitment to having integrity and telling the truth. The rules, they do this thing. We walk through this process. I get the rules. I take them on. I rely on them. I begin to discern what the rules want me to do, and then it leads me to have this at times demeaning a perspective towards other people, and I want to teach them, and now I'm doing things, I'm practicing things that I don't preach. That cycle will just keep going if we continue to let ourselves run that way through the rules. There is a slightly different way we could relate to them, however. There are a couple different ways we could relate to them. We're just going to talk about one right now. We could use the rules as an opportunity to see God's righteousness instead of mine. We could use the rules that way. Like when we walk through that process of receiving the instruction of the rules and then relying on them and then feeling like I'm discerning God's will and then feeling like I can discern between higher and lower things, and then how all that leads me to saying, oh, those other people should learn all the things that I've learned. That whole process instead could go something like, wow, I've been instructed by the rules. There's no way that I could possibly get all these things right. It's incredible, honestly, that God does. Right? We could use them as an opportunity to look at God's righteousness instead of an opportunity for my own. And that actually would begin to change a whole set of cycles that we have in our lives about how we relate to rules. Because over and over again, when we encounter different rules and standards that we see in the world or things that we want to take on, how do I get my career right? How do I get this relationship right? All of these rule systems that we get, they could first be opportunities for us to go, isn't it incredible that God gets the rules right every time? Because God does get the rules right every time. In every other instance in the world, no matter who we're dealing with or what set of rules we're dealing with, these rules and these systems and the people in them reveal themselves to be hypocrites and systems that create hypocrisy. But God is not a hypocrite. And in a world full of hypocrites, God is the only one who can say that he's not. What God says and what God does map onto one another every time. God teaches mercy and he demonstrates mercy. God tells us to act graciously and then acts graciously towards us. God elevates the importance of justice in the world and then, surprise, surprise, acts justly. There's no disconnect whatsoever between God's speech and God's actions. Because there's no disconnect at all in God's being, in God's nature. God is completely full, integrated, honest, self-consistent, and God's utter lack of hypocrisy is never so clearly seen than when we see it manifested in God's Son, Jesus Christ, the only person who's ever walked this earth who is not a hypocrite. I want to look at one well-known story with you about Jesus, just so we can see his lack of hypocrisy in and through this story. You know the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, verses 2 to 11. Let's look at it quickly together. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in their midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What do you say?" They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. As they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." There's so many things that we could pull out in this text. I want to look at one thing, this language of throw the first stone. Jesus says, right? He says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." This language of throwing stones doesn't quite carry the same weight and maybe even fear that would have carried in the ancient context. We talk about throwing stones. Don't throw stones. And we're imagining our little gossipy words. We sort of tink, tink, chuck at people, And so throwing stones kind of has some popular, maybe gossipy, prejudicial, bad behavior to it. Throwing stones in this context is talking about stoning. Right? Stoning was an ancient method of killing somebody, where you threw rocks at them until they were dead. Okay, let's just let that sink in for a second. So Jesus says to them, "Let anyone here who's without sin throw the first stone." I mean, we think at first, bringing this sort of popular conception to the table, we think that maybe at first these words would have been heard as some incredibly gracious thing. Of course, they are that. But to the woman who's hearing this in the first moment, what she's probably immediately hearing is, the person who has no sin, like, kill her. He's giving them permission. Let's get clear. He's saying anyone who can engage in this murderous act without immediately making themselves a hypocrite, go ahead and do it. Of course, then, one by one, they start to walk away. The older ones first, who come to the realization more quickly. You can imagine the younger ones being like, I'm almost there. I'm so close. Just wanting so badly to be able to execute this punishment. If anyone in this moment can engage in this without making themselves a hypocrite, go ahead. I mean, think about what that says. Like, the power of life and death is wrapped up just in someone's ability to say, I'm not a hypocrite. I mean, like, that's such a strange and wild thing to think about, that the person who does have the power of life and death in this situation is the person who would be able to say with total confidence, I have total and complete internal self-consistency. I'm just honest and have integrity in myself. And of course, there is someone who's present in this scenario who has the ability and the authority to do that. That, of course, is Jesus, who has every right and authority in this moment to throw a stone if he wanted to enact this punishment. Of course, he says, neither then do I condemn her, but not because he's been exposed as a hypocrite. Everyone else would like to condemn, and yet they've been exposed as not being able to because what's been revealed about them as a person. Jesus has been revealed as a person to be someone who is able to mediate the authority and the judgment of life and death, yet he chooses not to because instead he chooses to allow stones to be thrown at himself. Jesus' lack of hypocrisy is not seen anywhere more clearly than at the cross, where he chooses, though he has total ability to mediate life and death out on other people, he chooses instead to allow the sentence of death to be passed on himself as a way to totally vindicate God's internal self-consistency and trustworthiness. People talk about God and people are like, God's so far away. God has asked us to go through all this difficult stuff, and God's not helping. God doesn't know what it's like to be me. All these sorts of things that essentially trade on some idea that God makes demands of us that he himself isn't making of himself. And yet when we see Jesus on the cross, we see that none of that is actually true. God has never asked anyone to go through something that God was not willing to go through himself. There are so many reasons why Jesus died on the cross, so many truths and things that we get from it that we should hoard and protect and take on for ourselves in our own lives. But one thing that you should take away today is that at the cross we see that God isn't a hypocrite. At the cross we see that God was willing to endure in essence and in substance every single thing that humans have to go through in this time. There's nothing whatsoever hypocritical about God in that way. And if you actually were to just compare, just do some interreligious work and just compare even in a broad brushstroke the Christian view of God with the views of gods of other religions, they can't say this about God. God's too far away. God's too holy to step into human experience. God's too at peace and at bliss to step in to your experience of suffering. But the Christian God is a God who's willing to enter into the world and suffer and who says, I'm not a hypocrite. I'm like one person that you can trust in reality, who's not lying, who's not deceiving, who's not self-deceived, who's just totally internally consistent, and so I'm trustworthy. Romans 2:19, if we would just look at it again, this verse that just sort of points out most clearly our own hypocrisy is really the verse that reveals and reminds us of Jesus' total lack of hypocrisy, right? Paul writes, if you consider yourself a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children. Well, all of those really describe Jesus quite well, don't they? Paul's put them in like a line of things that make us go, oh gosh, I do feel that way towards other people. Maybe I should be a little more self-reflective and repentant. But if they were in a different context, we would go, thank God that Jesus is a guide to the blind and a light in darkness and an instructor of me, the foolish, and a teacher of me, a child, who needs to be taught as though I am a child, because I am. When we look at those and say how good it is that there is someone who takes these things on not as an expression of their hypocrisy, but as an expression of who they actually are, of their truth and their integrity. Indeed, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2 describes looking forward to Jesus as Jesus has a great light shining in the darkness. You know this passage from the Advent season. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. In a world that's full of hypocrites, there is a light that shines in the darkness of hypocrisy in this world, and it's Jesus. We just need to see really clearly how unique and valuable it is that there's one source of non-hypocrisy in the world, and then to go there over and over and over again. I mean, you can go to any number of different sources of wisdom and truth in the world that have beneficial things to give. I love this in my own personal life. I love reading philosophy. I love reading the classics. There's all sorts of wisdom to be drawn from other places. But every single one of those sources is infected with a fatal disease called hypocrisy. People who were just not able, because we are not able, to live in a way that's totally and completely honest and integrated in our lives. There's one place you can go to encounter the words of life from someone who's totally true. That's Jesus. And so you should let Jesus teach you. You should let him teach you. You should let him be authoritative over your life. The whole world, for thousands and thousands of years, has been searching for just one source of teaching and authority that would just heal, what would heal the world. Just one person in governance who's just, my gosh, when we think about governance today, we think about qualifications, we think about experience. The whole world has just been searching for one person who's able to do the laws that they mandate. Just one. If we could find one person who only gives the laws that they can totally fulfill themselves, like government would be solved. The ancient Roman statesman Cicero writes this in his book, The Republic. He says, "What can be more splendid than a state governed by worth, where the man who gives orders to others is not a servant of greed, where the leader himself has embraced all the values which he preaches and recommends to his citizens, where he imposes no laws on the people which he does not obey himself, but rather presents his own life, other than his fellows, as a code of conduct." The world has been looking for this since the beginning of time. This person has arrived, and his name is Jesus Christ, who only gives the laws that he's able to fully obey himself, whose life of commanding flows out of his own internal obedience, who at the end of the day achieves your obedience not with a strong and heavy hand of punishment, but by holding up his own life as a true and faithful example that you should follow. And so Jesus has begun to create a kingdom that is governed by this one good king. And your life is going to live under some authority. It should live under this one. The kingdom of God is the kingdom that passage is looking forward to. A kingdom where the only laws are the laws that the king himself follows all the time. It's the authority you wish your life lived under, and it can live under it if you would believe in Jesus. You should believe in Jesus and be free from hypocrisy. To be free from hypocrisy means at least two things. It means to be free from the hypocrisy of other people. We're not going to be able to avoid experiencing all of the hypocrisy of other people in this world because we just can't get away from everyone. And we can't get away from a hypocritical world. We're in it. We have to learn how to live in it. But you can get out from under the oppression and the authority of those judgments if you would sit under some non-hypocritical judgments instead. So few people who pass judgments are doing it as an expression of their concern to even be honest, to even be true. Judgments in the world almost always is an opportunity for somebody to win, for somebody to feel like they're right, something other than the concerns in which they trade, something other than the purposes for which it seems like the judgment is happening. You actually do need to be taught, and let me even say, be judged by somebody. You just need to be judged by someone who's not a hypocrite. I know that phrase, "don't judge me," carries a lot of popular and common currency. That phrase says something true about our experience of hypocritical judgments in the world and even in the church. But as a solution to all our problems, it actually just takes us wide of the mark in the final moment. We say, "Don't judge me rightly" to everyone who's hypocritical. But what we really want to say at the end of the day towards someone who's not hypocritical is, "Judge me. Help me see myself." If we don't take on some good standard of teaching and correction from somewhere, we just spend our whole lives running over the same weaknesses and blind spots and mistakes over and over and over and over again. You need someone to judge you. You just need someone to judge you. He's not a hypocrite, and Jesus isn't a hypocrite. He will never judge you from that place, and as a result, his judgments of you will never be full of all the weaknesses of hypocritical judgment. And to receive his judgments would free you from the authority of the judgments of other people. To be free from hypocrisy also means to be freed from being made into a hypocrite. We need to be free from the hypocrisy of other people, but we also need to be freed from the ways in which the rules and the way that I relate to them makes me into a hypocrite. You and I love to judge other people because we run through these cycles over and over again, and these are the things I got right, and so I'm an expert in this, and other people don't know what I do, and so we judge them. And the problem is that people don't like being in relationship to you and me when we are doing that. There are a number of reasons to not do it. The number one reason to do is because it's so distasteful. People don't like us when we do that. It's like a relationship ruiner. Like, stop it, please. And so we need to be saved from that for the sake of other people and also for the sake of ourselves. And we would be freed from our own hypocrisy and our own impulses towards hypocrisy if the rules became an opportunity not for me to feel good about what I get right, but for me to be in awe of the things that God has gotten right. And that would come to you if you would believe in Jesus and realize that he is not a hypocrite. Your experience with rules and standards would become to be opportunities. You still take them on, you still look at them. We're going to come back to positive things about the rules, but in that initial moment of engaging with some rule or standard and going, is this an opportunity for me to love my righteousness or God's righteousness? It would become an opportunity to love the righteousness of God, and that would begin to free you and cleanse you of the spiritual disease of hypocrisy that lives and is threatening to show up over and over again in you and in me. In order to do that, you have to commit, you have to desire, you have to be willing to love God's righteousness more than your own. And this is where we're going to end today, with just asking you to reflect on this question. Really, at the end of the day, how much do you love your own righteousness? That is maybe the most tasty thing that the rules hold out to us. The opportunity to feel like I got it right. And when we do that, there's so many things to say. There's a good place for pride and self-confidence and achievement, but underneath almost all of those things, there's a very basic dynamic. I love it when I feel like I got it right. And you cannot love that feeling in yourself and in the life of God at the same time. These rules that we encounter, they're either opportunities for you to love your own righteousness or for you to love God's. And if you loved God's righteousness more than your own, you both would get something in you that cleanses you from the spiritual disease. And at the same time, you would get something that gets you out from under the burden of the hypocritical judgments of other people. It would set you free from this dynamic. Your life would be better for it. You love God's righteousness more than your own when you see that Jesus was not a hypocrite and you believe in him as a result. Amen.